What's going on, guys? Hope everybody's having a great day. So today we're going to be going over the Daily Mail's video on Bryan Kohberger. It's titled, "Could Bryan Kohberger Walk Free?" Now, of course he could, because he is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.
All it takes is one juror to kind of plant that seed of reasonable doubt.
Bryan Kohberger is gearing up for the fight of his life against 4 first-degree murder charges. There's a lot of evidence against him, the latest being a News Nation report that he allegedly had an ID belonging to one of the victims in his possession after the murders.
Okay, so News Nation didn't say that. Chris Cuomo did not say that it was an ID belonging to one of the victims. They said that it was an ID connected to one of the residents of 1122 King Road. Later on, they have said that it was a resident's ID, but they still have not claimed it to be a victim's ID, just a resident's ID, which doesn't narrow it down to the victims, because we also have Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk. There's a lot of speculation, including by me, that it's very possibly Dylan Mortensen's ID.
In the court of public opinion, the 28-year-old criminology student has all but been convicted. A court of public opinion, however, is not a court of law.
Perfect. I'm glad they said that, because that makes me really want to say this. The court of public opinion is not the law, right? So information that the narrative that we've been fed from News Nation and other news sites, Law and Crime, from the police themselves, that information has formed us to believe the narrative that Bryan Kohberger committed this crime. If he didn't commit the crime, then we'll find that out at trial when the prosecution has no evidence for what they claim to have happened. The court of law, though, is a lot different than, well, I could believe that he did it. He looks like he would do it. He's a weird guy. He seems like the type that would do it. Well, if he did this, then he definitely probably did that. The law doesn't work that way. It's beyond any reasonable doubt. If the defense can paint a picture that it was somebody else, that's reasonable doubt. If the police can't prove that it was Bryan Kohberger, they can't tie him to the crime directly, then all they have is, well, he was in this area and there was DNA on the knife sheath. That's direct evidence, right? Well, there was a very tiny little fraction of DNA that the Idaho Crime Lab couldn't even find, that they had to send it out to another lab to be able to complete the profile of the DNA. I've heard a lot of talk about that, and it's not that, oh, they missed it in Idaho. It got sent out to another crime lab that had better technology, and they were able to put the profile together based off the DNA that was on the knife sheath. But either way, it's a very, very small amount. So the prosecution can't be saying that that very trace amount was put on that knife sheath during the course of the crime, right? Because obviously this touch DNA would have been there before, and it's just saying that his DNA is on a piece of evidence at the scene, and there has no good reason for his DNA to be at that scene. But what if he gives a reason that his DNA could be at the scene? Then do they have the case proven beyond a reasonable doubt? He seems guilty, but he could be innocent.
It doesn't matter if he looks like the type, if he gives you the creeps, if there's just something about his eyes. The only thing that matters will be the opinion of 12 jurors. Convincing 12 people beyond a reasonable doubt that a person has committed murder is a daunting task, and one that his defense team will try to thwart at every turn. And they've already started.
I like this. I think they're doing a great job so far. If you notice, she just said the same thing I said, just a very summed up version of it. It's very daunting for a jury who are assigned to not bring emotions into it, to only base their opinions on the evidence presented at trial. And I know a lot of people push back on this whole narrative that the jury would be people who don't know about this case. And I guess the main reason is it's too popular. That's an insane narrative, right? Maybe they've heard of his name. Maybe they heard about this crime taking place. But if they investigated this, if they tell the prosecution and defense that they have outside knowledge of this case whatsoever, past who's at, who was murdered and who the murderer was, and sometimes not even that if they have the option to not use those people. But if they have any ties to the case emotionally whatsoever, they're not going to let them be on the jury. And it's not going to be impossible to find 12 individuals in the state of Idaho to serve on this jury that has no idea who Bryan Kohberger or the Idaho 4 are, outside of maybe they heard it happen when it first happened. Because even though we take interest in this, so many other people couldn't care less if it doesn't directly affect them. Convincing those jurors that Bryan Kohberger did this is going to be based solely off of evidence that can be presented at trial. None of the YouTube stuff, none of the rumors of conspiracy or thoughts are going to be presented to the juror outside of what the prosecutor is telling them he believes it was and what evidence he has to back up that story in court. It's a lot easier to be like, yeah, he probably did it, he's guilty, on the internet than it is to sit in those juror boxes and decide, yes, they proved this case beyond any reasonable doubt without any direct evidence to him. You know what I'm saying?
If you know anything about the case of the Idaho 4, you know that investigators have uncovered a lot of evidence connecting Bryan Kohberger to the crimes. But former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani says defense lawyers will be prepared for a fight.
That's what they're going to do. They're going to put up factual roadblocks as well as legal hurdles as well. That's why you see them attacking everything.
From the time of his arrest, Bryan Kohberger has been working on his defense. One of the first things he did was waive his right to a speedy trial. This was so his lawyers could have as much time as possible to go through the evidence against him and find ways to poke holes in it. But
all right, so I've seen a lot of people who take this and they like to form it in their mind as some type of evidence that he's guilty. Because if he was innocent, he would want to get out of jail as soon as possible. Why would he postpone the pretrial hearing where all he has to do is plead guilty or not guilty? Why would he postpone that if he was innocent? An innocent man wouldn't do it. But you also have to stop and ask yourself the question of, why would the police grant 6 months? Apparently, they need time to build their case against him too. He has a master's in criminal justice. He's not a dummy. He's not an ordinary person. He knows that the more time he has to build his defense, the better, right? He knows that if he can find out what they're planning to say about him, then he can find ways to refute that. And he's going to look for any little thing that they have wrong or they have that they can't prove. And that's what they're going to refute. They're going to poke holes in the story. So it's not necessarily that he's guilty because he postponed it, but it makes sense that he would want to be prepared.
Something we don't often think about is how important it is going to be for the defense team to humanize him.
So you're really up against a lot. And so the more that you can do to present him as a human being who had all of these problems, the better. I try to get the jury to walk in their shoes and to understand who they are.
Humanize him, right? Make people realize that this is just another person. This is anybody, a guy like you and me. And he's just trying to live his life. And now he's being railroaded and accused of a crime that he didn't commit. That's what they need the jury to believe. That's what they need the jury to hear.
Bryan Kohberger is a petri dish of psychopathology. A defense psychiatrist would have a lot to work with.
The brutality of the killings, the innocence of the victims, frankly, the number of victims are chilling. And the prosecutor will tell the jury the story of a boogeyman, a nightmare made real, a masked murderer who appeared in the dead of night to massacre 4 people when they were at their most vulnerable, asleep in their beds.
Exactly. The prosecutor, he's going to tell that story. He's going to tell that story. And the defense, they have to refute it.
So it's going to be up to Kohberger's team to remind them he's just a young guy, a local student who might have even had a pretty tough life up until then.
Sympathy always plays. No matter what, if you have a sympathetic victim, you're going to win. If you have a sympathetic defendant, you're going to win. Sympathy always plays that role. If they feel sorry for you, then they're more likely to vote in your favor.
Helping the defense, what I do is really get into their life from the time they were born. And then I get into, their schooling. Were they bullied? Did they have any medical problems, when they were growing up, or psychological problems?
So this woman, that's her whole job, is to find sad sob stories. Her whole job is to find sob stories to tell to the jury about the defendant. Is that what she just said?
The way it works, according to forensic psychiatrist Dr. Lieberman, is like this. The defense team would hire a forensic psychiatrist like her who would sit down over the course of many sessions to unravel who the defendant is, from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, and identify ways to make him sympathetic to the jury. Dr. Lieberman has testified for the defense on a number of criminal trials and says that creating some empathy for the defendant can mean the difference between life and death.
Exactly. People don't need to forget that this is a death penalty case. He may go down by a firing squad, right? They know that.
So this is how humanizing Kohberger could come into play in his case for the defense.
What could a defense psychiatrist do with all that? Well, one thing, you could show the multiple times throughout his life, and even recently in a bar near where he lives in Pennsylvania, he was rejected by these women, and it was written in the notes, if this guy comes in, he's, going to harass you and so on. So you'd show that whole string,
So this is about the bar by his house. The bar back in Pennsylvania where he would come and he would drink and he would get kind of vulgar with the girls, right? And they had talked about it, left a note in the system that when he comes in, he might act this way or that way.
For all the years of his life. Then, and how painful that was for him and so on.
His defense team will then want to attack the evidence, how it was collected, the science behind it. The biggest piece of evidence that we know of so far is that knife sheath. It's a military-style K-bar knife sheath that was left at the crime scene next to the body of one of the victims. And according to police, Bryan Kohberger's DNA was the only DNA found on that sheath on the snap.
Right. Okay. So the knife sheath is what ties Bryan Kohberger to this crime at all, right? I mean, we have the stuff where he might have liked the girls' Instagram pages and followed them and liked pictures, maybe even saved pictures onto his phone, maybe even messaged one multiple times. That would be a connection to him, right? But the DNA is the only reason they thought to look at Bryan Kohberger's profiles. The DNA is the door that opened the way. And it's such a minuscule amount. So even though it's key to the case, I don't really believe that the prosecution is going to try to make the claim that that DNA was put on that knife sheath during the commission of this crime, right? I don't believe they can make that argument since that's the only DNA that was on the knife sheath. The knife sheath is just a door to get to Bryan Kohberger. well, we found this item there. It had his DNA on it. We looked into him, and now we find out all this other information that can connect back to this murder.
Sounds pretty bad, but forensics expert Joseph Scott Morgan explains that the defendant needs to be connected to the knife, to the murder weapon, in a lot more ways than just a little bit of DNA.
First, he's not connected to the knife whatsoever, as far as we know. He's only connected to the knife sheath. Just being fair. Being fair. There is no murder weapon that we know of so far in this case that has been found, that the police have, that the prosecution has. We don't have the murder weapon. There's only the sheath for the type of weapon they believe was used in the murder. And that has trace amounts of his DNA.
Well, the first thing you have to do as an investigator is to find out whether or not any person in that home owned a knife sheath that is similar to that. The defense will look at that.
To paraphrase here, the defense will want to know if one of the other roommates or perhaps one of their boyfriends also owns a K-bar style knife.
And then they would try to say that, well, Bryan Kohberger could have touched that knife sheath at any point in time in history, and then that boyfriend left it there, or somebody else got a hold of that and used that in the crime. Somebody came in the house and that was there and they used the knife. But Kohberger's DNA isn't on a knife. It's just on a sheath that maybe he touched at some other point in history.
And they can use that to then question whether the sheath found at the scene belongs to one of them and maybe not Bryan Kohberger.
Remember, it's reasonable doubt. It's not prove he didn't do it. It's instilled doubt, reasonable doubt. Is it reasonable to believe that Kohberger's DNA could have got on that knife sheath at any other point in history and that he had nothing to do with the murders? Is that reasonable? Because I think it is. I think that's reasonable because I've mailed out a lot of knives to people. And my DNA, my touch DNA could still be on those knives to the people who won those knives, received those knives, bought those knives. It could still be there. But that doesn't mean that anything they use it for is going to come back on me. So for me, there's absolutely a chance. And the defense would definitely preface all that stuff forward to say, maybe he touched it before. Prove beyond any reasonable doubt that he hasn't touched it before that night.
Okay, I'm sure you're thinking at this point, yeah, but investigators said they found Kohberger's DNA on the snap. I was thinking the same thing. It's kind of hard to argue that it isn't his knife, but I was wrong. Nima Rahmani points out that the defense will have their own theories and their own science to try to dismantle this for the jury.
The defense is going to attack the evidence in this case. And one thing that I expect them to do is attack the DNA, say it's not reliable, it's only one source, and it could have been transferred there by anyone. And there's going to be a whole host of other people that have DNA there.
A whole host of other people have DNA there. This is what the defense will likely latch onto like a dog with a bone.
It was a party house, right? It's a party house. Of course, there's going to be other people's DNA there. And it's in a known drug area. A frat boy and sorority girl college house. I mean, sorority girls live there now. Frat guys have lived there at other times. It always serves in those purposes, right? It's off-campus housing. They party. And when you're in college, you experiment a lot. And different types of people are around different types of people on a regular basis. So the defense is definitely going to rest on the fact that I'm sure they found a lot more people's DNA in that house than Bryan Kohberger's, given that it was a party house.
The scene of the crime here is unique in a lot of ways. There are essentially 3 crime scenes. Bedroom 1 on the top floor where Kaylee Goncalves and Maddie Mogan were killed. Bedroom 2 on the second floor where Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin were killed. And then kind of the house as a whole. 6 residents lived in 1122 King Road at one point, and the house was really known as a party spot on the University of Idaho campus. And this isn't just talk, there's proof. Body cam footage from multiple incidents show police dropping by the house due to noise complaints from different parties. We actually see Kaylee and Xana in some of these videos telling cops they're going to keep it down while there are who knows how many people in the house behind them.
I mean, I see a lot of people that get mad about this too, and they're like, oh, you're painting the victims in a negative light if you talk about this, but that's absolutely ridiculous. The victims were people. They were young people living their life, having experiences, going to college, meeting people, having parties, having fun. You make your mistakes when you're young. You learn from them. You become wiser. That's why, the older, the wiser. That's why that is a saying, because that is reality. Of course, somebody who's 40, 50, 60 years old is going to have more common sense than somebody who's 20 because they haven't been around that long. That 20-year-old might be book smart. They might know a lot more, but that older person is always going to have that wisdom of how things really work.
Can the defense explain away that forensic evidence with a forensic expert on the stand and say, could they have gotten there from a party?
Shout out Truth and Transparency. Olana made the video, made the Daily Mail video. I hope this gave you a huge bump, Lana. I hope it did. I'm a fan, right? I don't always agree with you. I think that we hold two very different views about this case, but you make really good content, and I enjoy watching it.
They have gotten there from...
Yeah. I suppose I could, and I think that I'm glad you mentioned 3, because it's like, if you got 1, that's a much easier hill for the defense to climb.
But if I were on the defense team, I would want this video above all the others to be shown to the jurors to really illustrate this point. What you're going to see here is footage from police responding to another noise complaint. But this one is different, and what makes it different is huge for the defense. See if you can pick up on it.
I don't know what video this is, but let's see.
How goes it?
Oh, hey, how are you?
Who lives here?
We're not actually sure.
You don't know who lives here?
No,
okay.
I don't.
We're just here for a noise complaint.
Oh, okay. No.
Well, no one's here that's trespassing, but no one that lives here is here right now.
Okay, so the one girl's there. They didn't even know who lived at the house. They were just there for a party, right? And these guys are saying, we're not trespassing. It's okay for us to be here, but nobody that lives here is here, right? I've seen this video.
So where'd they go?
They're just not here. I have no clue where they went. No clue.
So you guys just throwing a party in their house at this
time? They were here at one point. They're not here right now. I just searched all the rooms.
They left and went over.
Okay, now, when this did come out, though, I heard a lot of people get super upset. Like, how would this happen? This is very common. This is common in college. Is it stupid? Absolutely. I would never leave a bunch of strangers that I don't even know in my house when I'm not there. That's asinine to me. But that's college life. The door's always open. You have a bunch of roommates. Your roommates have friends you don't know. They end up coming. People end up kind of knowing each other. They move in the same circles. They don't really know them, but they know who they are. They just don't want to rat them out, Things like that. That's pretty common in college.
Over to some other party, and everyone is about to
leave and go over to another.
There's a raging party going on here, and not a single person who lives in the house was there at the time. This can really illustrate maybe how lax the girls were about their home. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people were in and out over the course of the semester, so the defense will argue.
All right, and what do we have right there? Anybody know who that is? That is Miss Bethany Funk, and she was one of the occupants of the house. She's one of the survivors, and she was home during this party when they said that none of the residents were home.
That it is more than plausible that Kohberger just attended a party there, and maybe that's how his DNA ended up in the house.
At least according to reports, there's a single source of DNA in the knife sheath. The defense, of course, will argue that was transferred, but you would hope to get a lot more DNA evidence at the home, especially.
Okay, let's go back. Now, the knife sheath, the DNA that's on the knife sheath, right? It's just a little bit of touch DNA from Bryan Kohberger on the snap of the knife sheath, meaning that they're not going to be able to say that that was there during the commission of the crime, because otherwise his DNA should be all over it. If he was wearing gloves, he wouldn't have left it on the snap, right? So there's just a little bit of DNA there. And the defense can say, well, Kohberger attended a party. He didn't know the girls, but he had attended a party at that house, and that knife was laying on the counter, and he picked it up and examined it, opened the case up, took the knife out, put it back, set it down, and then he's never thought about it again, never been there again, nothing. Prove that didn't happen beyond any reasonable doubt. If you can get rid of that DNA, if the defense can give a plausible reason for his DNA to be on that knife sheath that was found at the crime, then that's a big win. That's a huge win.
When the reports are that this was a party home and there were a lot of people coming in and out, so I fully expect there to be a lot of other DNA evidence in that house.
We tend to get laser focused on the single source of DNA found on the knife sheath, which cops say was Bryan Kohberger's. But when the house was processed by crime scene techs, they're likely to find dozens, hundreds of sources of DNA scattered through the house. Just look at these Daily Mail exclusive photos. This is the preserved crime scene. So after the murders, police left the home as it was, essentially freezing it in time so that they can process the evidence just how it was left when the bodies were discovered. So what you're looking at here is inside of the house, exactly what it looked like the night the killer slipped inside and knifed 4 people to death. It's a mess.
So they're saying they didn't clean their house up spotless every time anybody left. And they hadn't cleaned the house up spotless before these pictures were taken. Before, it's not like they had planned to be brutally murdered, though. Maybe they planned to clean up in the morning. But it's a good point. It's a good point.
It's what you would likely expect to see from a college house. There's food, wrappers, half-drank coffees, dirty dishes, beer pong, empty liquor bottles. Not only does this add to that party house angle, but it...
Imagine how much DNA is on those beer pong cups. Imagine. College party. How many different people played beer pong, drinking out of the cup?
Also shows just how easy it could be for a skilled defense attorney to argue that Kohberger's DNA was just one of many scattered around this house and doesn't necessarily point to him being a killer.
They've got to hold on to these, no pun intended, to these little threads that they can, because, and this is well worn, Caitlin, people will always say, all it takes is one juror to kind of plant that seed of reasonable doubt, in their mind. And there's no doubt in my mind that the defense is going to utilize that.
DNA at the scene isn't the only evidence that Kohberger's team will go after. A while back, Bryan's lawyers halted the cleanup of the crime scene once it was released by investigators because they wanted to do their own investigation in person.
This right here, the crime scene itself, this has been lost in time almost for what most people even talk about when they're reporting on this case. But there was a lot of problems during the investigation while the police were in and out of the house with not wearing their little booties and coming in and out, tracking stuff in and out of the house. And there's a little miscommunication on time frames from when certain things were discovered. And we don't know what happened in the house, what they touched or what they didn't touch or whatever. We don't know that. But we do know that another group of people came over and discovered the bodies and yelled for Dylan to call 911. Then we know that after the 911 call, other people came in and looked at the crime scene. They came into the crime scene to see what was going on. And then the paramedics got there and they were responding to an unconscious person. And they were in the house around the crime scene to see what's going on. And the crime scene has been contaminated after, because the police were done investigating the crime scene and they sent crews out to clean it up while Bryan Kohberger was being arrested. Wow, he was being arrested. What did that cleaning crew do? Did they change anything? that the defense might use as contamination of the crime scene. Because no matter what you believe, if Bryan is innocent or if he's guilty, what you should be wanting is the truth, right? You don't want it because you got a bet on the game and that's the way you think it's going to go. You want it because that's what the truth of the matter is. I feel like some people forget that sometimes. They start looking for loopholes and ways around stuff that's inconvenient rather than we're seeking the truth here. The crime scene being contaminated when we're talking in a court of law, that's huge. Anything could happen. Are we above dirty cops in any way? Do we think that that doesn't happen in a case where a guy who's got a master's in criminal justice and going for his PhD in criminology is accused of committing these horrendous murders? Do we think that people in those positions are above things like this?
Makes sense. But his lawyer needed a court order. His attorney and a few others spent about an hour in and around the property examining it and taking photos. And they had to get a judge to sign off to stop the cleanup so that they could go in. And this may be raised again at trial if his attorney tries to argue that potentially exculpatory evidence was destroyed. And speaking of exculpatory evidence, meaning evidence that could help exonerate the defendant, Joseph Scott Morgan points out what he thinks is a glaring error by investigators.
Exactly. They can argue that the people sent in to clean up the crime scene or the cops while investigating the crime scene destroyed something. We saw this in the Alex Murdaugh case with the white t-shirt that the police believed had blood splatter on it, but they destroyed it trying to test it to the point that the defense didn't have a chance to see the same shirt.
Before an arrest was made, some of the victim's personal items deemed unnecessary to the investigation by police were released to the family. And that may be a huge win for Kohberger.
I made kind of a stink early on about, do you remember when they said that they were allowing items to leave the property for the purposes of sentimental reasons, which was the biggest ton of garbage I've ever heard. Why would you do that?
You should never change the crime scene until everybody is satisfied and in agreement that the crime scene can be changed, especially wanting to tear the house down. That is an insane narrative to me. Why would you do that? What if the jurors want to see the house? What if they want to go to the house for the trial to get a feel of what happened and why? What if the defense brings in Dylan Mortensen and the jury needs to decide on if she would be a credible witness or not?
I wonder what was leaving. And this is even before his representatives had a chance to go through that. Now, an arrest, I don't think, and I might be misremembering, but I don't think an arrest had been effected at that point in time. But they had things walking out the door to God only knows where. What I would not have done, the release of the things from the scene, that sort of thing. I'm not a big fan of that. Never will be. Now they're going to allegedly tear it down.
And very early in the investigation, cops were accused of bungling some of the evidence collection.
There was a whole lot during the investigation that the police got trashed for. Now, a lot of that was just the internet nitpicking stuff, but not all of it was.
Garbage from 1122 King Road was allowed to be picked up and thrown into a trash truck with refuse from a bunch of other homes on the block. So cops in hazmat suits had to sift through the rubbish to extract the bags belonging to the crime scene.
And how did they know they got everything from all the bags or the correct bags? How?
So the defense can really question what might have been lost or tainted in the process. One of the other damning pieces of evidence is the cell phone tower pings, placing Kohberger's phone in the vicinity of the house. According to the arrest affidavit, his phone pinged 12 times near King Road in the months leading up to the murders. Cops combined that cell data along with CCTV footage of his car to tie him to the home on the night of the crime, but it wasn't exact.
We know the cell site evidence is key, but the defense is already trying to poke holes in that, saying that the cell phone evidence doesn't match up with the video surveillance of the white Hyundai Elantra.
That would be huge. If they have video evidence at a different time than the cell phone service, when a phone can ping off a tower for so many miles, that would be huge, right?
Minutes off. So all the defense can do in a case like this is raise reasonable doubt.
And it always comes back to that white Hyundai Elantra, the rolling crime scene, as Joseph Scott Morgan named it, where investigators are searching for forensic evidence like hairs and blood from the victims. Kohberger drove that car for nearly 2 months between the time of the murders and the time of his arrest.
And you would think that when they tested that car, when they tested the stuff in his apartment, you would think that if they did find something that could shut down all the speculation about his innocence or guilt or whatever, they would find a way to leak that information. We would have heard if they did find large amounts of the victim's DNA in his car, or if the seat had evidence of a lot of blood all over it, like seems like it would have been after committing a crime like this, right? I feel like we would have heard about that, but we haven't. We haven't heard anything of the sort. There's a gag order in place, so maybe that's what's stopping it and nobody's leaking. But that feels like it would be huge, absolutely huge, the police to come out and say, yes, we have more DNA evidence. But they haven't said that. The only DNA evidence that we know of so far is that touch DNA on the knife sheath. And if there is no more, if there's not victim's DNA in his car or at his home, that kind of gives a little doubt to the idea that he viciously murdered 4 people in record time and then ran out and jumped in his car and drove away and didn't get any DNA on his car.
Not to mention the fact that he and his father made a roughly 2,700-mile cross-country trip. The defense team is going to seize on that.
They'll even make hay of the car leaving Idaho and traveling all of that distance. And I apologize. I had looked up the mileage at one point in time from Pullman.
I think it's 2,700, if I can remember correctly, somewhere around there.
Yeah, and I can just visualize, because I've watched so many of these trials, I can just visualize one of these defense attorneys standing there and saying, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, 2,700 miles. How much evidence could potentially be lost along the way?
2,700 miles in one trip is a lot, right? That's a crap ton for a one-way trip. But 2,700 miles overall. He was arrested, wasn't it, December the 30th? And this happened on November the 13th. So how many miles was put onto his vehicle in between that time, in addition to the 2,700? So it's not 2,700 miles later. It's probably more like 4,000, 4,500 miles later.
Now, on this journey home, you're going to recall that Kohberger was pulled over twice by police in 10 minutes. And Dr. Lieberman says that the body cam footage indicated to her something peculiar about he and his father. What do you think?
Well, first of all, we don't know very much about his childhood. There have been tons of news reports about him and so on, but all we know is what we saw of his father in the car. That was a little strange. There's a clue right there that there is something strange.
All right, so Bryan Kohberger definitely looks strange here, right? The look on his face, he looks worried, right? But hell, I'm worried every time I get pulled over by the cops too. And his dad, I don't get the narrative about his dad. Like, I think it's perfectly normal that a father, that a son could ask his father, hey, I've got to drive my car from Washington to Pullman. I don't want to fly. I need to bring my car home. Would you fly out here and ride back, and we'll have a couple days trip, father and son? And the father agreeing to do it because his son is 28 years old, living in another state away at college. He misses him. He wants to spend that time with his son. I don't know why people make it like that's so insane of a thing to do. If I asked my dad right now to drive to California with me to pick something up, he would be happy to do it. He would put his life on hold so me and him could go spend a road trip together. So the idea that because he did it means he knows something, that's ridiculous to me. And his dad just seems like the normal type of person. He talks too much. He trusts police too much. He's giving out more information than it seems like Kohberger wants him to give, given the looks that he gives him. And he said some stuff. He said that they were leaving Washington State, going to Pennsylvania, and that Brent Kopaka at Washington State was shot by police for hostage situation or whatever it was that he says here that was going on there. And I mean, the Brent Kopaka stuff might tie into this case too, but that doesn't mean that the father knew about it. That just means that he knew that something was happening with Brent Kopaka, which was a very public event there when they left, right? I don't get the hate for the father.
She added that addressing potential issues at home as a child, as well as Kohberger's documented history of being bullied for his weight when he was a teen, as well as his alleged former drug use, all of that may connect with some juror on some level to create some empathy.
But we have to remember what she just left out in that little story is that he struggled with that because of his weight and stuff. But at one summer, he changed. He lost a bunch of the weight. He started working out and he got into drug stuff, but he had friends after that. He wasn't being bullied anymore after that. He wasn't seen as that loser anymore after that. And you could look at that as maybe he hit puberty late, right? Like maybe he didn't go through his change of life from being a kid and baby fat and not taking himself seriously enough until that time. And then he made a change. He took charge of his life and made it better. Or could it be that something happened during that time that caused his confidence to rise, that gave him satisfaction? Right? Could go either way.
Plus, there's this.
This I don't think would be very popular with the jury. One could try to say, if there was some evidence for this, one could try to say that these girls, or at least one of the girls, led him on, made him believe that she was interested in him, and for months, and then ultimately she rejected him, and so it was such a devastating change, and that's what kicked him off, what made him ultimately.
I feel like we definitely would have had more evidence of that leak out before the gag order and everything came up. I mean, come on. They had the girls' phones. They would have known if he was in contact with them. They would have known what was being said. Stuff like that would have came out. I don't feel like that happened. I don't feel like the girls led him on. I mean, maybe there's a narrative where the OnlyFans stuff might have been true, or Snapchat stuff, some stuff like that is none of our business, honestly, that he had a parasocial relationship with one of the people. But as far as like actually leading him on, having contact with him, why wouldn't we know about that contact? Why wouldn't anybody else know that they knew each other in any type of way? I think if Bryan Kohberger is guilty, I think it's more along the lines of he had that relationship in his mind. He wanted and was rejected. I don't think that they have any evidence for the idea that he was led on by the victims. And it feels like victim blaming. It really does feel like victim blaming. And I don't say that lightly, because I hate it when people try to say you're victim blaming just because you make a statement. But to say, oh, well, maybe they let him on. Yeah, maybe. But maybe anything, Why do you believe that they let him on? What evidence do you have that they led him on?
Ultimately, kill them all.
I agree there. That probably wouldn't be popular with the jury, and it kind of risks the admission that Kohberger was mad or upset with one of the victims, so it is really unlikely that we are going to see that particular angle play out in court. But what we know we will see is a serious defense of Bryan Kohberger's innocence from his lawyers. Now, there is a teeny tiny minuscule chance that he will plead guilty at the next hearing and this would all be over, but we are far more likely.
I don't believe that he will plead guilty. I don't believe there's any chance in hell that he pleads guilty, especially after stretching this out for 6 months. But there is the slightest little bitty tiny chance that he, given his background and education, looks at the evidence against him that they have, and he says, I'll do it for a deal. I'll plead guilty for a deal. But I doubt it. I highly doubt it, because I don't think they would offer him a plea deal. And then what benefit would it benefit him at all to just admit his guilt? Where would it benefit him? It would help the families of the victims so they didn't have to go through the trial. But where would it benefit Bryan Kohberger? Because the type of person who's going to go in and murder 4 people in their beds while they sleep is not the type of person who's just going to admit that they did that when it's all negative for them afterwards.
To see this heading to an explosive jury trial in the coming months. And as you've heard, the road to reasonable doubt is rocky for the defense, but it is possible. So until then, check out all of our wide-ranging coverage on the Idaho murders on dailymail.com.
All right, so that was the Daily Mail's video, and it's on their YouTube channel. It says, Idaho murders. Could Bryan Kohberger walk free? Idaho students update. I'll put the link to that video in the description of this video. Now, I feel like this video does a good job of presenting how Bryan Kohberger could walk free, how his defense could take on this case. I don't think this is some rare, crazy take that I have. I know my mind works a little wild sometimes, and I don't always say things perfectly as I mean them or explain my thoughts as well as I should, which is a bad thing when you're a YouTuber, really. But I think that they did a good job here pointing out the ways that Bryan Kohberger can be defended. I think that a lot of people forget that Bryan Kohberger doesn't have to go to court and prove that he didn't do it. And you can convince yourself without even realizing that you're convincing yourself that he does have to do that. When I say that the prosecutor has to prove the case against him beyond any reasonable doubt, that prosecutor has the burden of proof. If there's any doubt left in, then the prosecutor cannot get a guilty verdict from the jury. The defense's job is to come in and instill that doubt in the jury, to say, this can't be proven. This is, my client says this didn't happen, that this went this way, that this is our version of events, to refute the claims made by the prosecution. Instill doubt in the jury. Give them another road to go down. Reasonable doubt. When that road forks into 2 possibilities, guilty is no longer an option. What do you guys think about it? Let me know down in the comments below. Also, check the description down below. It's got links to my memberships, links to subscription, links to the Cashapp, PayPal, my email if you want to contact me personally. Hope everybody has a great day. We'll see you next time.